Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Mega Projects. This one is all about the Wright Flyer, which in a way, this is like the smallest airplane ever, or like just, a bunch of sticks and cloth and a little motor put together. Barely feels like a mega project, but also first plane. So, definitely a mega project. Let's jump in. 17th of December 1903. A rickety contraption that shares few similarities with our modern aircraft wobbles down a purpose-built track, its small engine roaring in anticipation before lifting somewhat unsteadily into the air. There it remains at a height of no more than 6 meters, 20 feet above the beach below, for a total of 12 seconds before coming in for an ungainly and bumpy landing. The short flight certainly wouldn't win any points for style or poise, but what had just taken place changed transportation forever. The first ever aircraft, or really the first powered heavier-than-air machine to achieve controlled, sustained flight with a pilot aboard, if you want to go with the Smithsonian's official description, took place just south of Kitty Hawk in North Carolina with the Wright Flyer, or the Kitty Hawk as it's sometimes referred to. While it would be some time until aviation for the masses took off, the small plane built by Orville and Wilbur Wright that lifted off that morning was the catalyst that changed everything. Humans still couldn't fly, but finally, they built something that could. While our attention today will be focused on the Wright Flyer, it's only fair to discuss various models that very nearly beat the Wright brothers into the air. This was a time when the scent of aviation history was in the air, and several people around the world had either come close to or achieved feats that weren't deemed sufficient to be considered the first real flight. Russian naval officer Alexander Fyodorovich Mozhaisky built a 22-meter, 75-foot monoplane and performed an 18 to 30-meter hop in 1884 using a ramp for an assisted takeoff. The fact that the monoplane and the distance covered were roughly the same lengths must have meant that it wasn't exactly a sight to behold, and it does rather make me think of one of those cartoons where the character runs off the edge of a cliff and just dangles there in the air for a moment before back to Earth. A Frenchman by the name of Clément Ader built a Batwing aircraft powered by a steam engine that apparently flew for 50 meters, that's 164 feet, on the 9th of October 1890, and potentially as far as 182 meters, that's 600 feet 2 years later, though this claim has been refuted over the years, which has in turn muddied Ader's reputation somewhat. Apparently he just got a little overly boastful later in life. So, why was this not considered the first flight? Simply because his Batwing aircraft wasn't capable of prolonged flight because it used a steam engine. And while it is harsh, it's also fair. The German immigrant who settled in the US, Gustav Whitehead, built several aircraft before the Wright brothers, which included a steam-powered plane that flew in 1899 and a petrol-powered aircraft that was said to have taken to the skies on the 14th of August 1901, though sadly with little to no reliable evidence. In New Zealand, farmer and part-time aviation pioneer Richard Pearse performed several test flights before those of the Wright brothers, and there have been consistent rumors that a full flight and landing took place 9 months before the historic day in North Carolina. Whether or not the Wright Flyer was really the first aircraft into the skies is something that we'll probably never be entirely sure about, but for the sake of the narrative of our video today, we're just gonna say that it was. And it's also, it's widely accepted, right? I mean, controversial, but when you think of first in flight, you definitely think of the Wright brothers. The two brothers, whose names would forever be associated with pioneering aviation, hailed from Dayton, Ohio, and if you ever needed an example of people who succeeded without a formal education, then the Wright brothers are just that. Neither man completed high school, but with no doubt plenty of influence from their mother, who herself was said to be quite the mechanical whiz, they went on to leave their own enormous mark on history. Born 4 years apart, Will was the oldest, born in 1867, followed by Orville in 1871, their interest in aviation was piqued by a toy helicopter that their father returned home with one day. Years later, they followed with fascination many of the earliest glider flights, in particular the exploits of Carl Wilhelm Otto Lilienthal, often referred to as the Flying Man, the first person to make repeated successful glider flights, and who died when his glider stalled and he fell 15 meters back to Earth. And if ever there was an example of the fine line that early aviators trod, well, it was Lilienthal. After testing their mettle, pun definitely intended, with a successful bicycle business, the brothers' sight settled upon a challenge of monumental proportions: to build a machine that would finally make human flight possible. The events near the end of 1903 were the culmination of several years of work by the Wright brothers, in which their experimental kites and gliders gradually evolved into the Wright Flyer. In 1899, they built a biplane kite with a 1.5-meter wingspan, that's 5 feet, which also incorporated wing warping for the first time, a series of pulleys and cables that twisted the outer edges of the wings essentially to try and mimic the wings of a bird. The following year, in 1900, they upped and left Dayton to begin testing their glider designs. Their destination, close to Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, had been chosen for its regular sea breezes and relative isolation. No doubt also the prospect of crashing onto soft sand was more appealing than, say, well, rocks. The Wright brothers were unquestionably brilliant, but like any savvy minds, they certainly took stock of what was going on around them in the early days of aviation. The death of Lilienthal in 1896 had been a shock, but sadly it was pretty common among the daredevils that took to the skies during the formative years. One point that the Wright brothers agreed on was the need to perfect glider control before making the transition to powered flight. They regarded many of the early accidents as being down to poor quality, or maybe just a total lack of pilot experience. Things were still really rudimentary in those early days, and missteps frequently led to tragedy. Between 1900 and 1902, the brothers tinkered with a series of manned gliders, the last of which was the 1902 Wright glider. This was loosely based on the Chinook Herring biplane hang glider, which made several successful flights in 1896, reaching a furthest distance of 109 meters, that's 350 feet. The 3 Wright gliders, 1900, 1901, 1902, gradually increased in size and ended up at 9.8 meters by 1.5 meters with an area of 28.3 meters. Much of the early testing was done unmanned, with sandbags often used for ballast and the glider tethered to a rope attached to the ground. There's even a story that exists of a young boy being used at one point, and well, that would be insanely dangerous, but also an amazing story to tell to people back at school. The final glider that emerged had a much thinner camber, that's the distance between the 2 aerofoils, or just the thickness of the wings in super layman's terms, and perhaps most importantly, a movable vertical rudder, which was a complete game changer. It revealed that rudders on aircraft don't work exactly the same as they do in boats, and that they don't control the turning of the aircraft, but rather align the aircraft correctly during banking turns and when leveling off from turns. The final glider now utilized the 3-axis control, with wing warping for roll, lateral motion, forward elevator for pitch, up and down, and rear rudder for yaw, side to side. This led to the first controlled turn on the 9th of October 1902, and I don't think I'm overstepping the mark by saying that aviation history was well and truly made on that day. It was a historic month, and during October 1902, the Wright brothers made more than 1,000 glide flights, several of which exceeded 182 meters, that's 500 feet, and one of which lasted a mammoth 26 seconds. The following year, while working on the Wright Flyer, the brothers set the world record of 43 seconds for a glide flight, then beat their own record the following month in November, as the 1902 Wright glider soared for a total of 1 minute and 12 seconds. But while the Wright brothers no doubt got a great kick out of their continued glider success, they had bigger fish to fry. In many ways, the Wright Flyer was incredibly similar to the 1902 Wright glider. Indeed, some aviation historians claim that the 1902 glider was a greater step forward than the 1903 Wright Flyer because of the development of the 3-axis control, a system still used by aircraft today. The frame of the first powered aircraft was built using spruce and ash wood, with Pride of the West muslin for surface coverings. These surfaces were then painted with what was described as canvas paint, probably paraffin dissolved in kerosene, a substance also used on the sails of ships. It used a purpose-built 12-horsepower gasoline engine, which is about a quarter that of the engine of the Reliant Robin, which is basically a toy car, and it powered the aircraft's twin 2.4-meter propellers. The engine itself weighed just 81 kilograms, that's 180 pounds, and was cast from a hard aluminium alloy made of 92% aluminium and 8% copper. It turned over 1,025 revolutions per minute and used a sprocket chain drive, something more commonly seen on bicycles than engines. It also came with what might just be the smallest petrol tank of all time, carrying just 1.5 liters, that's 0.4 of a gallon. The Wright Flyer was essentially a wooden airframe with 2 large wing sections, one above the other, and connected via a series of spruce poles. The airframe was held firmly in place with 15-gauge bicycle spoke wire, which crisscrossed between the upper and lower wings. The pilot would lie slightly to the left of the center line because the engine was slightly to the right, and no, the pilot and the engine didn't weigh the same, which was why the right wing was 10 centimeters longer than the left. It had a total wingspan of 12.29 meters and a length of 6.43 meters. That's 40 feet feet 4 inches and 21 feet 1 inch respectively. In front of the pilot was a 4.6 square meter, 48 square foot double front elevator, which, if you remember, controlled pitch, that's up and down, via a series of levers and cables, and behind the pilot was the 1.9 square meter, 21 square feet, movable vertical rear rudders controlling the yaw side to side. The final part of the axis was the wing warping, which again was controlled by the pilot through a series of cables that would curl the ends of the wings separately or both together. So essentially, a single brave soul would lie in the middle of a wooden airframe with levers to control the 3-axis control system. It's an image that seems implausible compared to modern flight, but many of the basics really haven't changed one bit. In the weeks leading up to the historic first flight, the team was plagued with issues, and a broken propeller shaft meant that the entire aircraft had to be shipped back to Dayton for repairs. However, by early December, with preparation seemingly in their final stages, the brothers felt confident that they could achieve the historic feat of first flight. But there was one last major issue. The question of which brother would pilot the Wright Flyer on its maiden voyage was settled by the good old-fashioned toss of a coin, and it was won by Wilbur. On the 14th of December, Wilbur Wright took his place inside the Wright Flyer as it was positioned on its 18-meter track built using 2x4 planks of wood. Aboard the aircraft were 3 instruments that would record the momentous occasion: a Deere engine revolution recorder, a stopwatch, and a Richard hand anemometer to record the distance. The propellers whirled into action and the Wright Flyer slowly began moving before slowly inching off the ground. But it was not to be. At least, not yet. Just 3 seconds after takeoff, the engine stalled and the Wright Flyer hit the ground with a mighty thud, causing minor damage, which thankfully was repaired over the following days. And so you probably remember that coin toss that Orville Wright lost. Well, as you would have it, fate was with him as he took his turn in the Wright Flyer 3 days later at 10:35 a.m. on the 17th of December 1903. Once again, the engine sputtered to life and the propellers began spinning. The Wright Flyer lurched forward, gaining speed before lifting unsteadily off the ground. The distance of 37 meters, that's 120 feet, that it flew on its second attempt is shorter than the wingspan of a Boeing 747, but it may as well have been 37 miles. For the first time in recorded history, a powered, heavier-than-air machine had achieved a controlled flight lasting 12 seconds and traveling at roughly 10.9 kilometers an hour. That's 6.8 miles an hour. For the rest of the day, the brothers in turn piloted the aircraft, with distances gradually increasing. The final flight, with Wilbur at the helm, flew for 259 meters, that's 852 feet, and lasted 59 seconds, already a huge increase on what had been achieved earlier in the day. Unfortunately, the final landing had broken the front elevator supports, a fairly minor bit of damage that they hoped would be fixed quickly. But the story of the Wright Flyer has a strange ending. With a gloriously successful day under their belt and no hope of any further flights that day, the small group of 5 witnesses and the Wright brothers began dragging the aircraft back towards its hangar. It was at that point that an enormous gust of wind suddenly whipped the Wright Flyer away from its handlers and sent it cartwheeling down the beach, gradually disintegrating as it went. When it finally stopped, the historic aircraft lay in a tattered heap. The Wright Flyer, the first aircraft ever into the air, would never fly again. It's difficult to imagine what kind of thoughts must have been going through the Wright brothers' minds at this point. Oh, I can imagine. They were like, that was sick. We did it. Elevation, triumph, and then horror watching their aircraft be smashed to pieces by a freak gust of wind. To rub salt into the wounds, large sections of the press simply shrugged as if the achievement was no great feat. The day that we now commemorate as the start of modern aviation, for many, passed just like any other. The following year, the Wright brothers built the Wright Flyer 2, and after a bumpy start, by the end of the year, they had accumulated 50 minutes in the air across 105 flights, including the first ever circled flight on the 20th of September 1904. Yet still, their exploits were often disregarded and at times labelled as just utterly fraudulent. Long before video and with only a sparse number of grainy photos, it was difficult for many people to believe it. And this was across the world. The French in particular poured scorn on the brothers, with many newspapers referring to them as bluffeurs, which you could probably guess means bluffers. So in response, Wilbur took an aircraft to France in 1908 and made the French eat mounds of humble pie, of the American variety, of course. Suddenly, it was all confirmed. Doubters apologized, and the Wright brothers' name became known across the world. The US Army soon came a-calling with a request for an aircraft capable of carrying 2 men, which could stay aloft for an hour. This, plus the incorporation of the Wright Brothers Company in 1909, made a huge amount of money for the Wright brothers. But things were still a long way from a viable commercial use. Wright planes were often used at air shows, but few were actually interested in buying and flying one themselves. This was made worse by a series of fatal accidents involving the Wright planes between 1912 and 1913, when 11 pilots were killed. The Wright Flyer was one of the most important pieces of engineering the world has ever seen, but using it was still a harrowing prospect, and the importance of pilot training very quickly became apparent. Humans had now mastered the skies, but it wasn't necessarily a place that everybody should go. As we mentioned earlier, the original Wright Flyer never flew again, and today it resides in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., a flimsy wooden canvas contraption that's difficult for our modern minds to even see as an aircraft, but which made history on its one and only day in the skies. So I really hope you enjoyed today's video. One brief reminder here at the end, don't forget that Mega Projects, this channel, has a sister channel called Side Projects that does similar topics but covers projects that are generally on a smaller scale. When you combine Mega Projects and Side Projects together, that's 6 days of content a week. So make sure you're subscribed to that channel as well as, of course, this channel. And thank you for watching.